work, Jefferson and Clallam County, and we initiated the cleanup um, back in the mid 90s, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But I want to also thank our other sponsors, the Northwest Toxics Communities Coalition. That is a 4-state coalition, Idaho, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. And we all work on issues relating to cleaning up hazardous waste in our communities. The University of Washington Superfund Research Program has been supporting Northwest Toxics communities for a number of years through a national grant they have to work with communities working on Superfund or hazardous waste cleanups. And then also our other sponsor is Sierra Club North Olympic Group. That is a group that also covers Jefferson and Clallam County on environmental issues. So thank you to our sponsors. Next slide, Peter. This is the Port Angeles Harbor, and Peter has put up a little white arrow at the top right, which is where the Rainier Mill is at the very eastern end of the Port Angeles Harbor in Clallam County. This is basically the city of Port Angeles within this harbor area. And the issues relate to the sediments and the groundwater and soils, and Peter will talk about that. Next, Peter. So a little history here. In 1997, May 1st, Rainier Mill, it was a pulp mill, and it closed on May 1st, 1997. And the Olympic Environmental Council formed a coalition of local residents and state and local nonprofits. We petitioned the U.S. EPA Region 10, the Seattle office, to investigate the pollution because Rainier had operated for 7 years. We knew it was very polluting, and EPA did accept the petition, and they came in and they did a massive sampling and analysis of harbor sediments throughout the whole harbor and throughout the mill, and also to landfills where Rainier dumped its waste over the several decades. They all ranked high enough for Superfund. EPA chose to just list the mill site, that's the sediments and the mill site, and let Clallam County, who is over our landfills, just continue overseeing those. Next slide, please. So from 1998 to 1999, there had been some investigations, and some of the soils had been removed that were highly toxic, that were moved out of the area. But most of the infrastructure was allowed to go up to the Port Angeles City landfill, and that is where the stuff sits. In 2000, EPA decided, I'll say it another way. The local leaders did not want to have a reputation that they had a Superfund project in their community, and Rainier did not want their investors to know that. So the powers that be talked to Governor Locke, he was our governor at that time, and state and federal officials, and they supported the site going to ecology. And it did go to ecology. They promised they would clean it up in 7 years. it went to one of the departments, the solid waste department. In 7 years, not much got done. When the Puget Sound Partnership was created by the state legislature, the site was handed over to another ecology department, which it always should have been in the toxics cleanup program. And that program came into the community in 2008. They repeated sampling and analysis of some of the sediments. Also, what was in the soils around town, and those soils they were looking for dioxins. So basically, over the years, we haven't had much. It's a whole process, as probably all of you know. And the cleanup was now going to be the entire harbor under one model toxics cleanup program. That's a state program parallel to the federal EPA program, Superfund program. But Rayonier is a standalone cleanup. And over the years, we've seen many documents come out, and now we are at a time when Rayonier has created its own cleanup action program. There are 5 options Peter will go into, and the Rayonier's chosen the next cheapest one for them. This was approved by Ecology and the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe. Those are the 3 principal decision-making parties on this Rayonier and the harbor cleanup. So that's where we are today, and our coalition and many, many others, we sent in a letter, OEC sent in a letter to Ecology with 60 signatures of major environmental organizations and citizens saying we want a better cleanup than that. So, Peter, you want to take it from here?
I do. I want to
put me on mute.
That last slide. Thank you, Darlene, and thank you to all the sponsors and everybody for attending this afternoon. I do need to point out that a couple of things. Number one, I started working with OEC in 1999, which is 20 and a half years ago. At the time, I had hair, and now I have grandchildren. So I don't think it's a fair trade. We're cleaning this up, as Darlene pointed out, under the state law, and there's an important point to be made there, and that is not all states have a state cleanup law for Superfund sites. Like the air or water or solid waste, the federal law has certain mandates, requirements, and permit programs, and the state, any state, may operate that program so long as they have the same provisions in state law that are contained in federal law. So, so Washington State has that in the Model Toxic Control Act. Those provisions must be the same or more protective. So they have to be the same or better. So we're doing that under MOTCA. You will hear me refer to Superfund, and in a couple of places, very specifically making a comparison. These are the issues that OEC would like to make sure. We want to have full public access, and they want to have restoration as much as possible. One of the challenges with all Superfund sites, for those of you who've worked on them, is obtaining that last part, the restoration, to see what can be done to put things back the way they were. And of course, no community across the country wants to stand up and say, hey, we had a Superfund site and we're happy that it still left a big, ugly footprint. So that's one of the obvious things. I think most people know, if you're not from around here, you might not be aware of the fact that the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe is a federally recognized tribe, so they have different legal rights. And Ennis Creek, which is located right over on the eastern side of the pier, the dock that's located here. Ennis Creek has a discharge here. That's where it empties out. And I've got another slide that'll show that from a different view. The paper mill operated for, you know, the better part of the 20th century until 1997. And it was principally a pulp mill. And it was a bleaching pulp mill. And one of the reasons why we had dioxins and furans, principally dioxins, in the waste is that the process produces it. So EPA, a number of years ago, realized that dioxin contamination was a problem in our waterways, and they investigated at the national level after they had some indications that there was something going on in our pulp and paper mills. And they implemented what was referred to as the 106 mill study, and they found that the process of using chlorine to bleach the organic component of the wood in order to make pulp, in order to make white paper, resulted in the formation of the chlorinated organic dioxins. And those are highly toxic, and we've known that for a number of years. That's not a surprise. In fact, the only new information that has been revealed about dioxins and toxicity has been more of the same, more toxic, more endpoints, more persistent. It's just more of the same. So the mill closed because it was not effective for the company to operate it any longer. It was no longer cost effective. And you heard about how we got to this point from there. What we've gone through is an investigation of what's the nature and extent of contamination, both in the upland, that is in the soil around the footprint of the plant and nearby, as well as in the immediate area of the harbor. Now, the state also included the larger harbor as the Puget Sound investigation and cleanup. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll get into where that has gone. But this effort is the next step in the formal process. And the formal process will be to evaluate a range of cleanup options in terms of methods, technologies, and approaches, and they will have an alternative for each one of those. And they will be for the three areas listed over here. For the marine area, which is the sediments, for the upland area that includes soils and beach areas and those places right along the shoreline, and then the groundwater immediately beneath the upland soil area. So we have three distinct areas that are being investigated, three distinct and really quite different sets of approaches to cleaning those up. And the reason is that they are just not like one another. You can't use the same methods, the same equipment for cleaning up groundwater as you would for cleaning up sediment. The general list of contaminants left behind by the pulp mill is listed here. There are various metals, some of which came from the process itself, a number of which came from materials used in the pulping process. And the same thing is true for organic chemicals. The wood itself also left waste product, and the waste product from wood is to a large extent where the logs were brought in, and because of the way they're handled, they shed a lot of bark and a lot of wood scraps. So there's organic wood waste and everything that's contained within the wood. And then breakdown products of wood and side products of those. And then in the pulping process, pulping is a high temperature process in which they have to cook it. They have to cook they have to shred the wood, and then they have to cook it. And so by cooking it, they have to have a high temperature process. And that burner has the capacity to create its waste, not just ash, but other waste. And then the equipment all has to be maintained. So we have equipment that is used in the process and then equipment that is used to keep the process going. So they had a machine shop. And over the years, machine shops, industrial machine shops around the country grew to use the latest and greatest lubricants, and other materials. And in the 1940s and 50s, the latest and greatest were PCBs. So PCBs were not only used in transformers and capacitors by large electrical companies and supply companies, but they were also used in paints, they were used in caulking, they were used in sealants, they were used in machines to keep the machines lubricated and keep them from cooling, keep them from overheating. And it was their physical properties that were so advantageous. They didn't break down, they didn't conduct electricity, they didn't, they were thermally stable, they had a greater insulative property than the alternatives. So they began to start using more and more PCBs. And when you're using oil in industrial equipment, unless you're careful, it's going to be leaking. And unless you're very careful with the floor of the factory or whatever shop it is, those leaks can get out of the shop and into the groundwater and into the soil. And that's exactly what happened. So Rayonier wound up distributing materials in the air emissions. That would be some of the PCBs, but mostly it would be the byproducts of wood combustion and everything in the wood. And then it would be the byproducts of the pulping process. And that latter step is where we get dioxins, not only in the immediate area, but also in the greater Port Angeles area, both within the city and in the surrounding areas. So those are the sources. One of the sources of metals would be from soil, and from soil that turns out to be native, and it's taken up, some of those materials are taken up into the native wood, and then it's concentrated once it gets into the waste products, particularly into ash. There's only one potentially liable party, and that's Rayonier. So here's a little bit more detailed list of the contaminants. I've mentioned dioxins and the related compounds, furans. I've discussed PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls, and they were used widely. The PAHs, or polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, are the byproducts of burning or heating to a high temperature oils and materials like that. Some of us will remember that PAHs were principal constituents of creosote when we used creosote to treat wood and make railroad ties and so forth. Phthalates are now recognized as toxic chemicals. They're not inert. They have been used for a number of years, and they're being phased out in a number of cases in their use as plastic agents. And as a plasticizing agent, the phthalate, like BPA, adds a physical property to those plastics. But in addition to that, in smaller amounts, some of those phthalates were used to add to waters so that the waters would have the right viscosity and flow characteristics. So phthalates were also a byproduct in the pulp mill, as they were in paper mills, as they were in some other industrial processes, because water itself has certain physical properties that are better augmented by certain additives. And then the metals over there, arsenic, mercury, manganese, and lead, are elements of the earth. In no small part, they came from local materials. They came from local soil. They came from local wood. And so they concentrated, and they were found in the ash. So not only were they found on the site, but they were also found in the waste that was put up in the landfills. And as an aside, one of the things that results that came out of the investigation of both the landfill and the site was a contamination by manganese. And manganese, like so many other metals, is a neurotoxic chemical that will cause severe central nervous system problems at appropriate concentrations. So we think lead, we think mercury, we think central nervous system problems, particularly in the developing child and the fetus, and manganese is the same way. The wood waste itself is a problem because it breaks down, and as it breaks down, it consumes the oxygen, and you result in what's called an anoxic layer of water down there on the bottom where the wood waste accumulates. Now, I bring up wood waste also in the context of the larger impact of the pulp mill. So far, we've mentioned its footprint, where the mill itself sat, and the groundwater beneath that footprint, and maybe a bit larger. That groundwater also is going to be in contact with water from the harbor. So the harbor is the other source. So we've got those three sites. Those three are related directly to the immediate operation of the pulp mill. But because the pulp mill operated over such a long time period in a harbor that has water moving in and out, and it has currents, it has a lot of ships, it has various other activities, there's no reason to believe that any waste that found its way into the harbor would stay put. And in fact, that's exactly the case. So there's a huge concentration and accumulation of wood waste at the harbor end away from the mill, that is at the western harbor. And that cleanup, as Darlene made reference to, is under a different effort. And that's going to be cleaned up under a different activity. But Rayonier will still be responsible for the accumulated wood waste. And there are some chemicals that are produced by the breakdown of wood that have accumulated over there. Another aside about wood waste, we think about it's just a paper mill, just a wood processing facility if it's a sawmill or something where they're just handling wood and they're not doing any chemicals. But a number of decades ago, and I don't want to age myself by saying how many scientists discovered that there were fish, small minnow-sized fish, downstream of a wood processing facility that were having problems. And those problems, we now know, are sex change problems because they were exposed to chemicals that were causing their reproductive systems to change from male to female, principally. And what happened was that these were naturally occurring compounds leaching out of the wood in the upstream wood processing facility. So there's no reason to believe that that wouldn't have the capacity to happen here. I haven't seen any data that it has because there's so much water and it's broken down quite readily by a number of bacteria. So those are our principal contaminants that we're worried about. And of course, the dioxins, the PCBs, are organic chemicals that have such a slow breakdown that they're considered to have none. Arsenic, mercury, manganese, and lead are metals or elements that do not break down ever. They might change chemical form, but they're not breaking down, so they will not be going away. So here we are back to the study area, the immediate study area, and then I wanted to show you here the Western Harbor area where a number of acres of wood waste have accumulated in the bottom of the harbor, and that's going to be cleaned up separately. But you can see here, this is the principal dock area, and then over here to the west side, we have the area where the logs were brought in. That's referred to as the log pond. And then we have this, we have our cursor coming back. We have this green stripe here, which is the green corridor associated with Ennis Creek. Ennis Creek outflow is there. The other thing that contributed to pollution of the sediment, particularly in this area, is an outfall pipe that was legal and permitted and had been there for a long time period, but it brought wastewater this far out into the harbor. And one of the things, of course, that wasn't permitted is that as the years went by and EPA changed the criteria, they changed what could be discharged and they could change the numbers. And then they discovered the PCBs were coming out from there as well. So this was another source of contamination, that pipe that of course you don't see, and it's inoperative now. Here we have an older picture of the facility, and you can see it occupied a pretty large space. You can see logs in the log pond, and they are being abraded against one another, so that's where they lose their bark, and that bark will sometimes float and sometimes it'll be carried away. You can see things going on here. You can see the outfall from Ennis Creek. You can see Ennis Creek, some of the operating facilities here. You can see this is another operation that's going on here, and that operation has to do with handling the pulp and exactly what they did. And of course, that is not free from chemicals either. Not small part of this multi-acre space here is not a naturally occurring piece of hard ground. It's fill. And the reason why that's important is because it will have different properties. You won't have compacted soils. So compacted soils will be treated very differently and will behave very differently with holding groundwater, where groundwater moves, releasing groundwater, and it's just a physically different material. So it has to be treated that way. And this is from some time ago, obviously before 1997, when it was taken down. Okay, we separate here the entire study area from the marine, giving it a little bit more attention, and the upland. And the upland is also the approximate footprint of the groundwater contamination. And as you can see, the groundwater is also going to have intimate exchange with that shoreline area. And that will flux back and forth. So you're going to have, and from an engineering perspective, there will be difficulty in containing that and maintaining that border between the salt water moving in this direction and the groundwater moving down in that direction. Under certain conditions, when you have a lot of rain and more water flow coming off of the high ground up where the hospital is on this higher ridge, then the flow will be mostly in this way into the harbor. But then when you have high tides and when you have abnormal weather events, it's possible, and in fact, it's certain that you're going to have the movement of salt water back in towards the groundwater, and there will be a sloshing back and forth across that space there at the intertidal zone and below. So I made reference to EPA versus the state. The EPA formal method, the flow of information and activities is shown here along the top. You see that as we described, there is a remedial investigation either at the state or federal level. And then they conduct a feasibility study and they identify what the methods are that they might use. Now, the document that we're reviewing now, and which has a comment period closing on Tuesday at the end of the day, and I'm not sure whether that means 5 o'clock your time or later. The feasibility study has those options that they considered and rejected, and they decided for a reason they had to give that they didn't want to use it. There may also be methods that they didn't even think about, and I've been through that process with a number of Superfund sites, including formal Superfund sites like the lower Duwamish River, which is located closer to the University of Washington in Seattle. And then after they go through the proposed plan, that has to be out for a formal public comment period. And that's what we're doing now. We are in that process of looking at their evaluation of cleanup methods and cleanup combinations of methods. Then there will be a formal and legally binding recorded decision. And then they go through designing the cleanup and implementing it and monitoring it. As another small aside, as soon as the entity starts to dig under this step here, under their action, as soon as they start, the term is the first shovel in the ground, then the clock starts ticking on a 5-year review requirement. And that 5-year review is true for EPA and at the state level. But during this time period, we have a public comment period that's mandated, and they must read everything and they must have some sort of response to every public comment, but not necessarily individually. If they get 100 comments that say the same thing, they can do a bulk reply. Okay, so that's the difference. You'll see that they have the same flow of process, and that's because they're required to. Okay, I've mentioned this before. Sediment, which is the largest area, it's out there in the harbor. The upland soil underneath the footprint of where the property had the plant, had the pulp mill, and a little bit larger. And then the groundwater, which extended out that far. The groundwater does not extend into the harbor. It's only beneath the hard land, as they say. And as I said already, the wood waste will be handled when they clean up the Western Harbor. When they look at the options, and this is something I hope somebody's either got the document and they're going to look at it, you're going to see what looks like a fairly formal and scripted and proscripted series of chapters. And that's true. They are proscripted because the document must have an evaluation of the methods, just like it has to have an explanation and a reasoning for those items that are rejected. They must have an evaluation of those alternatives, those methods that are accepted. And they do this with a scoring, and they score it according to these criteria. So the first ones are protecting human health and the environment. So protecting human health and the environment means it complies with the legal limits, the legal numbers. If the state has set a legal limit on how much arsenic can be in soil or how much PCB can be in fish, and that's part of the cleanup strategy, then they must comply with that in order to be protective. They also have to consider both short and long-term impacts. Now, let me explain briefly what that means. The long-term, of course, is many years, but they don't go to 50, 60, 80, 100 years. It's 30 years. They go to 30 years. And we already know that things like dioxin will persist for more than 30 years. The reason we know that is because that experiment is still underway. Dioxin is also, in addition to being formed by these industrial processes, it's also formed in chemical reactions, not on purpose, but as a side chain reaction, as a contaminant. And when certain herbicides were manufactured, synthesized, they could not be synthesized at an industrial level without forming dioxins as well, which means that dioxins were contaminants in herbicides. The herbicides used in Vietnam contained dioxins. And we still have Superfund sites around the nation where that contamination is a problem and the dioxins continue from the 70s. So we know how that experiment turns out. If the dioxins are left in place, they will stay there. That's the long term. The short term really means during the construction of the remedy, during the cleanup itself. The example would be dredging. The long-term impact of dredging may well be that the water body is deeper and that the surface sediments that were there before are just absent. They just dredge up the contaminated sediment and leave the harbor or the river or the pond or whatever it is. They leave it deeper. It also may be that instead of leaving it deeper, they put down a layer of clean material in order to keep the same bottom contour because they don't want it deeper. That's possible. And that's done in some places. The short-term impact would be, what does the dredging do to the immediate area during the dredging activity? There's an excellent example of that short and long-term dredging impacts on the Hudson River. And even though their dredging, for now at least, is over, they did a lot of posting on the web of their monitoring during the dredging to make sure that there was no excessive short-term impact by disturbing those sediments. And that point was just all over the news, and General Electric tried to make a bigger deal of it than EPA was willing to accept. And EPA said, no, the methods are available to keep that impact down to a minimum. So dredging impacts in the immediate area are not going to be so large. EPA won that argument. So the other short-term impact that we might have here could be the impact of moving materials by land in a truck from the site up through residential areas. And that is not an unreal concern. And in fact, I do know of at least one community that did not want to suffer through that large number of trucks or train travel. So they said, no, willing to go with plan B rather than plan A that would have trucked all this contaminated material through our neighborhood. And we'll live with a higher risk of plan B because we don't want the risk of plan A, which is hauling that stuff through like their town. So that whatever option is selected and all the options that are considered have to be evaluated there. Permanence is the other one, and I've made reference to permanence in the long term. So how do we know that it's going to be working in 10 years, 20, 30, 50? There's again another example, and it's one that's fairly close by that at least one of the other people on the phone is familiar with, and that is the permanent solution used at one part in an early action on the lower Duwamish River, when a range of options were available for cleaning up this fairly reasonably small part of the Duwamish River, and the responsible party said, no, we're not going to choose options A, B, or C. I don't remember how many there were, because any of those options would leave some contamination in place, and we would have to always go back and make sure everything was still working the way it was supposed to. They chose for the most extreme and permanent solution, which is take it all out. That's the permanent solution. Sometimes the permanence can't be achieved at that level. Groundwater is always a concern with permanence. There are some places where the groundwater is sufficiently confined and the contamination is such that if you just keep treating it, eventually the contamination will go away. That's seldom the case, but I've seen it work. Okay, the next criterion is cost, and they have to look at, the cost, and these numbers will appear in the cost of each one of the alternatives for each one of the remedy categories. So you'll see each one of the 3 alternatives for groundwater, and the 3 alternatives for soil, and the 5 alternatives for sediment will be ranked, will be rated according to these criteria, and there will be costs for every one of those. As an example, the cost for maximum removal of all the sediments is 3 times higher than the costs of which is what's called the construction cost. This is the dredging and hauling, moving it to a registered landfill. The effectiveness is whether or not only will it be permanent, but will it reduce the concentration, the toxicity, the amount of contamination. So do we know it's going to work, or do we just think it's going to work? Is the way to think about that. Implementability is whether or not it requires a new method, a new technique, a new regulation, a new law. Implementability would come into play if the concerned parties, particularly the state, did not have access to a piece of property. Then it's not readily implementable. If they know they have access to a property and it's either belongs to the state, so they can make that decision, or if they want to make, or if it belongs to the company that's the owner, they know it's accessible. But if they don't know who owns it, then it's less implementable. And finally, the last two requirements are the public concerns, and that's what we're doing now. So public concerns will weigh into their decision. I don't have a great deal of confidence professionally in my 20 some odd years of experience. There are a few places across the country where I've seen public concerns improve the results. They have improved the final decision in terms of what would happen. One of those places is down in Portland. That public concern may have been subverted. Another one is on the lower Duwamish River. And that's a place where they received thousands of comments in more than 10 languages. Another one is over on the East Coast in North Carolina, where the city council and the public, the general public who are on the phone today on the webinar, had the same message. And they said, this is not good enough. We need more from you. And EPA put more into the solution. And then the overall benefit is a little bit less specific. It's a little vague there, but it has to do with whether or not the property is cleaned up and is back into some sort of usable condition. I put this note on the bottom here because for those of you who are reading the document, I hope that more people will read it than not, there will be a no action alternative always considered, and that consideration is legally required. It's legally required at the federal level, and so thus it's required at the state level. We can think of this as the background or the baseline evaluation. What happens if we don't do anything? Well, it won't be protective of human health and the environment if we don't do anything, because it isn't now. Is it permanent? No, because we're going to be facing this contamination forever. Is it free? No. No, the no action alternative is never free because somebody has to keep going back there. So that it still gets ranked, but the no action alternative is not something that I've ever seen used in the modern era. I did see the no action alternative used in the original decision for the Hudson River because they didn't know what to do with 200 miles of PCB contaminated river that went all the way from upstate down to the lowest part of Manhattan, which is called the Battery, for those of you who've not been there. These are the choices that EPA, that Rayonier made and that were approved by the Department of Ecology for release to the public for comment, which is soil 2, sediment 2, and groundwater 1. Now, I think the first two can be explained fairly simply, and you can imagine what those are. Soil 1 is doing just cover. Soil 2 is consolidating cover. That means they're going to scrape things up. They're going to have a pile of stuff, and then they're going to put a clean cover on it. SL3 is dig it up and move it out. Sediment 1, 2 through 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, have increasing amounts of removal. Now, along these lines, which I find to be a little bit unusual, the sediment removal is only for the sediment and not for the dock. The dock is being removed, according to this document, under the natural resource damage assessment process. So all of the state and federal resource agencies have insisted that the dock has to go. So that removal is a baseline. That's going to happen anyway. So sediment 2 has some removal and it has a little bit of covering, and most of it far too much of it has what they call natural attenuation or natural recovery. So the most extreme of the sediments, I'll show that in a minute, removes all the contamination they could find. All of these options are based on maximum cost effectiveness. So that as you remove more, you incur more costs, but you get more reduction in harm or potential harm. And so they weigh this cost benefit. And the benefit is how much toxicity or damage do you get out of the system. And they do use the peak effectiveness. I've skipped over groundwater because I want to explain what sparging is. It's not obvious unless you're a beer brewer and then you know what sparging is. But sparging has been used, as have the other options in the groundwater suite of alternatives. Let me show you what sparging looks like. Sparging looks like pumping air or some other gas into the ground. Over on the left, and this is a real site, and it happens to be one that I worked on. It had great visuals, and it worked. So that's one of the reasons to use it. So over on the left, what you see is a large field. Down here in the lower right-hand corner of this part of the image, you see these covered areas, and that's where the pumping equipment was located. But you see these little dots, and these little dots represent pump areas. Those represent, I guess we could call them wellheads. Now over here on the right, we see a completely different view and a slightly different area. These are the individual wells where they pump something into the ground. In this case, there are a couple of important features. Number one, they were also in marine waters. These were lower salinity waters on the Turtle River in Brunswick, Georgia. The seawater is naturally occurring under there. The brine, however, was augmented by the process because they used brine in the process for this mill, which was not a pulp mill. It was producing chlorine for the pulp mill next door. But they also had mercury, and they leached mercury into the groundwater. And because mercury dissolves at a much higher, is very soluble in water that is very caustic, because they were also releasing caustic, they have a lot of mercury dissolved in the groundwater. So the goal in this case was to return the pH, the acidity of the seawater, back to normal or maybe a little lower. This would cause the mercury to come out of solution. And so that was an effective way. So they pumped carbon dioxide, which is an acid, they pumped it in there, and then they went back and tested. And they used a pilot program, which was the only sensible way to do sparging. So this was carbon dioxide sparging. I've seen other cases where they do air sparging or air stripping, where the intent is to simply bring air. You could bring oxygen in there. I've seen other more active chemicals, so carbon dioxide, oxygen, sometimes ozone, air, but nitrogen could be used, and it has been used, but air is cheaper if you're going to have an inert gas. And so what they do is they put these wells in place and they test them, make sure everything's operating, and then they do a trial run. And the trial run depends upon the condition at the site. How deep, how wide, what are we trying to achieve? And in this case, they ran it for a bit and they waited to see, took some samples, and then they ran it for a bit longer, and they discovered how they had to pump, what pressures, how long, all those sort of in place to make sure how they work. Sparging will require that step, all of those steps, anywhere they do it. But it doesn't keep the contaminants that are in the groundwater from moving all the way to the shoreline and into the harbor. The problem that they face here at Brunswick, I mean, not at Brunswick, they have that problem at Brunswick in a different place. But here in Port Angeles, the problem we have is that the contaminants, you will recall, include organic chemicals, chlorinated organic chemicals that do not break down well, if at all, and metals. And one of the points that you will read in this document is that they couldn't find methods that would work on both organic chemicals and metals. Okay. But they didn't look hard enough to find if there were two different methods, one that would work for organics and one that would work for metals, that they could use either together or in sequence. So the much better options are these, which would be SL5, maximum removal. Same thing for soil, maximum removal. Groundwater, no matter what they do, they're going to have to do a pilot. But I think G3 has a better opportunity for treating the chemicals before they can get to the harbor. But on G3, on groundwater, they're going to have to be ready to do a trial, and maybe it won't work. Okay, so that's mostly what I have to say about that. And I do want to add one other thing for which we don't have a slide. And that is for those of you who are interested in one of the other serious points that we keep making at Superfund sites that has been made here. It's been made on the Duwamish River. It's made in Portland, on the Housatonic River, the Hudson River. You get the point. It's a water-based concern. Global warming and climate change will affect most of the Superfund sites in the nation. A week ago, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, released a report indicating the number of sites, Superfund sites that they found, that they investigated and found would be subject to harm, that the solution, the remedy would be subject to harm from global warming and climate change. This investigation was initiated after Hurricane Harvey, did such devastation to Houston. One of the things that happened there was that some sediment that had been covered in place in the river was exposed by the extreme weather events. And so there was a request that came out of Congress to the GAO. GAO investigated. They released their report a week ago. It has frightening consequences. Here's how we comment. We're going to turn this over to make sure that we can receive questions. So thank you very much. And Lisa, I think you're going to see if they have questions.
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, so I'm going to read some of the questions that have come in while you were talking, and I'm going to read them in backwards chronological order. So from Steve Kohler, what potential for shoreline harbor development is there for various cleanup options? Does more cleanup mean more development?
I don't think more cleanup means more development at all, but that is entirely up to the city. The basic cleanup in each case must have the same level of protectiveness, which, if I understand it correctly, and if I'm reading this correctly, would not require or only allow industrial development.
Okay. And then this is from John B. Based on the toxics found, in your opinion, how dangerous is the Rainier site? How dangerous is to walkers on the Olympic Discovery Trail that skirts the fenced-off portion of the site? How dangerous is it to any other people, for instance, people on the bluff above the site, to build on the question immediately above? How dangerous is it to boaters using the marine area? So a lot of questions there in one.
Yeah, currently the danger lies in a couple of different areas. So let's start with the latter one. The boaters are probably the least if they stay in the boat. And the reason I say that is because the contaminants that we've been talking about are contained within the sediments. So if you stay out of the sediments, you have the least likelihood of being exposed to any of those chemicals. least likely, not zero, least likely. Walking on the Discovery Trail, I happen to agree that that's not a good idea to run a trail through a contaminated site because of exposures. If you have some confidence that your estimate of exposure, we know what's going to be there, it's only going to be there, it can never be higher, then that's not a problem. But where we have found, where investigation has found elevated concentrations of chemicals, just because you've got them off the trail doesn't mean they're going to stay off the trail. That doesn't mean the immediately adjacent sites are not going to contribute those toxic chemicals onto people on the trail. As far as up on the top of the bluff, again, I haven't tried to estimate that. That can be estimated, and probably the Department of Ecology would say that it's such a low chance of being exposed to anything that they would probably say that it's a minimal risk situation. I haven't looked at it to know whether I'd agree with them or not. So that's trail walkers, boaters, hike along the shoreline that a number of us have done before, which, you know, if you're a healthy middle-aged person, which I no longer am, I guess, it's not a good idea to do that because it's going to be related to exposure. But, you know, a child playing in the sand is going to get sand in their mouth. They're going to eat some sand. And children and people who have chronic illnesses, people who have a compromised immune system, are going to be far more vulnerable to the effects of these toxic chemicals, particularly in combination.
Okay, thank you, Peter. A question from Judith. You mentioned that some of these chemicals have or are affecting, quote, greater Port Angeles. How concerned should residents within a mile or two of that area be? Finally, is this a 10, 20-year project?
Okay, the chemicals that were distributed around the residential area came from air emissions and a few from the trucks that were hauling waste up to the landfills. So that would be a transportation corridor question for the properties on either side of the road. But dioxin in the soil in Greater Los area, and at the time I think that they were minimizing the concern. And I think now that so much more time has passed, we discovered that dioxin is more toxic and is of greater concern. As a result, I wouldn't be so sanguine about saying that there's no concern. I think both the state and the county health department need to re-examine that and consider whether or not those concentrations of dioxins remain. And if so, it's a matter of digging up soil. It's not a complicated mechanism. The cleanup, I don't remember what they said in terms of timeline. 10 years wouldn't be surprising because they're going to have what's called a fish window. They're not going to do any in-water activity during the spawning season because so much time and energy and effort has gone into restoring, particularly salmon runs and those other important aquatic species, that they don't want to take that as a risk. And in fact, they're not allowed to.
Okay, great. Another question from Judith. The harbor is all one bowl of water, so to speak. So I don't understand even thinking of it as two cleanup areas or doing areas at different times. If you start over here, it affects over there too. Why is that not a concern?
Well, the state can't do both of them at once to the same level, but they already did start cleaning up some of the Western Harbor activities. It wasn't all Western Harbor. The Western Harbor was just the harbor part of it. There were land-based areas that they've already started in on, and those have their own energy, their own activity, and their own decision documents. But the reason they put the Western Harbor as a separate decision document is for administrative practicality. If they're going to be cleaning up one part of it, I think that there's a very good reason why it makes sense to be doing all of it. But if they can get this one going after 22 years, I wouldn't want anything to hold them back. They can get the Western Harbor moving along. It might have to do, and my estimation would be that it has to do with how many different cleanups can one group of people conduct at one time. Because the harbor is not, doesn't have flow like the river. So the river, it makes no sense to start downriver and move up to your source. You start at the source and move down.
Okay, thank you. And then just a clarifying question from Judith. I thought it was never designated as a Superfund site. It was or is?
So the process was that it was petitioned for investigation. And EPA conducted a site investigation, an extended site investigation. As a result of those, it was proposed as a Superfund site. So I say Superfund because that's the process. We all use the Superfund process, whether or not it's cleaned up under MODCA or by EPA or by the military, which would be a formerly used defense site, or by Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which would be any facility that already has one of those permits, which is any industrial facility must have those in order to operate. So the Superfund is mostly about the process. Because it was listed, it was proposed for listing, the first step was taken. But once that step was taken, the state of Washington, as Darlene explained, requested and did everything they could to insist that they get their turn at it. They get to do it. And EPA listened to them.
Okay.
EPA, just an add a bit to that. EPA does retain and cannot give up a level of oversight so that the final action must be approved by EPA.
Okay. Now a question from Mel Malmed. You mentioned that the mill was partially built on fill and that has different cleanup implications. Can you please elaborate?
Sure. Fill will not be compacted soil the way that other things along the shoreline, other areas along the shoreline have. So that compacted fill along the shoreline that's naturally occurring may have a combination of silt, sediment, clay, and laid down in layers. This will be put down as fill material. It will be there with the intent of creating extra land and supporting the industrial activity that they knew was going to be there when they created it. So it's going to have much larger stones. It's going to have a larger, interstitial water. So there will not be the same level of compaction of clay as there will be use of large supporting substantial stone. And the cleanup implications are that the groundwater is going to flow very differently, and it may be uneven.
Okay. I'm just going to add here that to everybody, if you're wondering how you ask a question, you can use that chat box option, or you can raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and just speak directly to Peter. So we have a question from John B. next. Based on your understanding of the chemical contamination of the site, could you elaborate on the health dangers? High risk, medium risk, low risk?
So is that, I assume that's for the site as it exists now. It's different for different parts of the site. So it's not really the site is, all this risk, because the harbor sediments are pretty toxic. They contain PAHs as well as PCBs and dioxins and metals. So the harbor sediments and the groundwater has a range of chemicals as well. The sediment is going to be, the soil is likely to be less immediately dangerous, but it's going to be dangerous in the long term. So I'm not sure where this falls in terms of high, medium, low, and what it compares to, because you're not going to get sick walking onto the site. Once you walk onto the site, if you pick up chemicals, it's likely that they will have an impact on your health down the road.
Okay. This is a question from BJ Cummings. How long will ecology require Rayonier to guarantee the remedy? On the Duwamish site, EPA decided to require a 50-year rather than typical approximately 20-year guarantee for Boeing's cleanup site, which increased Boeing's cost to the point where it was cheaper for them to voluntarily take all contamination out.
I don't know what the requirement is. And this particular question is whether or not the company, Rayonier, will be able to take this site off their company's books of liabilities at some point down the road and wash their hands of it, to put it bluntly. I don't know, because that goes strictly under state law, and while the state law must comply at a minimum with the federal law, it can go beyond that. And it can also go beyond that if the state agency folks, which means not just the site manager and their project manager, but they would probably go all the way to ecology, would be able to keep that decision up if they say we want it to last forever or 50 years or something longer than the minimum. And I don't know what the minimum is in Matka.
Okay, thanks. Do we have any other questions from the participants? I'm not seeing any. Does anyone want to raise their hand? Oh, one new message from Steve Kohler.
Mm-hmm.
What authority does the city have to make land use decisions on the site and adjacent areas with regards to cleanup versus contamination?
That would be outside my direct area of expertise, Steve, but I think they have pretty much primal authority. I don't know that there's anything that limits their authority to make land use decisions. And I do know of other situations in which the local city has done that. And if the city makes that decision at the right time, then it must affect the nature of the cleanup in terms of permitting activities that the city has said they want permitted. Okay. Well, we thank everybody and hope that everybody gets a comment in.
Oh, sorry. We have a question from Howard Sprouse. So Howard, I've unmuted you.
Yes.
Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Howard.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Peter.
Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me, Peter?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you fine. Sorry, I was having a little trouble with my tech here. Yeah. Can you comment about the transport and fate of the contaminants in the upland soils, particularly breakdown of dioxins and furans?
Sure. The dioxins and furans behave pretty much like PCBs. In the upland soils, those chemicals are going to be attached to soil particles that are rich, dark, humic soils. So they're not going to stick to sand. It will adhere to the organic part of the soil. And traditionally, that can be washed away or washed down into deeper soils. We see that the same is true in sediments and soil. And we also find that that's true when we look at groundwater, where we don't find a lot of dioxins and PCBs unless there's some other reason there. So because those chemicals stick to the sediments, and those sediments are not part of the water, they're going to be washed away. If they don't get washed down into the soil, then those very lightweight, small organic particles are going to be transported farther away. They'll be transported towards the harbor. So that's what their fate is going to be. And they're not going to break down. They're going to be there till my grandchildren don't want to visit Port Angeles.
Okay, thanks, Peter. We have 2 more questions from the chat box, and then Robert, I see that your hand is raised, so we'll get to you as well. This is a question from Karen. If the Rayonier proposed options were completed, 1, would people need for safety to stay off the site? And 2, would the trail use be safe?
Okay, number 1, would it be safe to use the trail? Probably in the immediate time period after they finished the remedy, until we have some sort of weather event which causes damage and redistributes the contaminants, and then no, you're going to be picking up contaminants, because it's just really a matter of time before a weather event comes along the shoreline and washes things away from where they were supposed to be. Sediments that are soils that are consolidated and covered will not stay that way forever. So whether that's next year or 5 years, I don't know. So what was the other part of her question? Or did I get it all?
The other part of the question is, would people need to stay off the site for safety?
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah, once it's all cleaned up, then, as I said, the health department, ecology, and anybody else will say, well, it's safe to go, and it may be safe for a little while, but it won't be safe forever, or even a long period of time.
Okay, and then we have a question from John B. Am I correct in assuming that the Olympic Discovery Trail is within the Rayonier site cleanup area? It is dangerous, in your opinion, to walk on the trail.
The Discovery Trail goes through the site at that particular point in the harbor. And as I said, healthy middle-aged men are probably at a very low risk from any contaminants that they're going to be exposed to, because they can't keep the contaminants from getting to people who are walking on the trail. Unless you sprint.
Okay, good news for sprinters. So now I'm going to unmute Robert, and you can go ahead and ask your question. Robert, are you there?
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. So thank you. So, yes. So my question is about if the preferred alternative is the one that ends up being done, what activities could occur on the site? Just as an example, could one have a land-based aquaculture facility at that site and not poison the people working there or the fish that they were growing?
Okay. So if they, and that, of course, we're talking about 3 different efforts. One of them would be to consolidate and cover the soils on the site and to sparge the chemicals out of the groundwater. And we assume that on site does not mean out in the harbor in the mud, in the sediments. So we'll take the sediments off the list. They won't let anybody back on the site until the sparging of the groundwater has resulted in a reduction of organic chemicals to the point where they can't vaporize. So right now, if you go on the site, the groundwater has chemicals that can come up in vapor through the soil. And that has to be corrected before the site can be used. If it stays that way, then an on-site aquaculture facility, if everything stays the way they put it, well, an onshore activity is probably within health guidelines and is probably not unsafe. But then you're taking a chance that conditions are going to stay the way that they put them at the end of the cleanup effort, both for groundwater and for soil. And so I don't know how they predict that or how to estimate the likelihood that the soil is going to be left undisturbed. Now, they will be required, no matter what they do, to go back and inspect it every few years or maybe more often. So whether it's groundwater that has to be sampled once a year, or soil that has to be sampled, or they have to go inspect the soil that's been consolidated and covered, or go back and check anything in the water. But there will be a requirement to monitor and maintain anything left behind other than clean. And as soon as they find something that is not as they left it or not as it was supposed to have been left, then there's going to be more activity. So the most certain is maximum removal of the contaminated soil and sediment. That's how they get to the point of being able to put something on the site with no concern that it's going to be disturbed and returned to a toxic site situation, notwithstanding what the water might bring in terms of seawater.
Okay, so last question from Karen, and a comment from Steve that's related. The Rayonier proposal keeps referring to stopping people trespassing on the site. Does this mean that people will be barred from the site forever? And then Steve adds, bad news for the thousands of folks who do the Olympic Discovery Marathon.
So that's to be determined. Literally, I mean, it's going to be, people will be barred from the site during the construction, but we're talking about afterwards. So when they finish consolidating and covering the soil, if they're going to leave under one set of conditions, then yeah, they will have to bar people, which really should mean a fence and inspection and much more activity. And does it mean people won't be able to do the marathon? You're outside the realm of my experience or expertise, Steve. I really had never thought about that, so I don't know.
Okay, I think that I'm going to unmute Darlene. I think she may have had a question, and then that might be our last question for the session today.
Okay.
Darlene, can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, my phone went out and I had to call back in, so I might have missed this, but and if you already spoke to it, Peter, just stop me, but there's another process going on here, parallel, and that's called the Natural Resource Damage Assessment, or NRDA for short. And this is made up of federal agencies, excuse me, and the tribe, and I'm not sure who else. But this is private conversations. It's not open. and they do not come, and the agencies do not come and talk to us about their discussions and what is going on. But the Interior Department has some oversight because of the water. And of course, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, has a say in the sediments. And we may hear in the future what their process is and how they intend to deal with the sediments and the rest of the upland infrastructure. So this is a whole nother level, and I don't know when we'll learn about it, but that is ongoing.
Right. It's behind closed doors, and it's federal and state resource agencies. So National Marine Fisheries Service, which is in the Department of Commerce, will have a role in that, and they'll have a seat at the table, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state and the tribes. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for calling in. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you've got enough information that you can consider making comments to ecology before the 26th and share your thoughts and concerns. And especially they want you to relate your comments to significant issues here, not just we don't want it or we want it, but link your comments to some of the issues that ecology has laid out and Peter has talked about in the sediments, in the groundwater, and upland. Thank you, University of Washington. You've been great. I really appreciate you doing this.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you, Darlene, and thank you, Peter, for your time. And thank you for everyone who writes in comments, too. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording and we'll end the meeting.
Oh, and this will be up on your site for people to go back and hear it again?
Yeah, we have the meeting recorded, and we'll get that up on our website. It might take a little while. I know our web staff is overburdened right now with someone out of the office. So I can't tell you when it'll be up, but sometime in the near future, it should be.
And you'll let all of us know, perhaps?
Yeah, I should be able to send an email and let all of you know.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks all for joining.